So, welcome back. Thank you very much for being here. Previously went over roles, resumes, cover letters, references, portfolios, college degrees, hard skills, soft skills, hiring managers, and recruiters. We're on chapter 9 now, moving forward out of 31 chapters. I want to remind everybody this is from a United States perspective. Right now, we're in November of 2024. So, all information subject to change moving forward. Some of it has changed since I've made these slides, and we'll get into that. So, right now, we're looking at chapter 9. Interviews. Greetings, traveler. I'm going to share with you some epic information about interviews. Interviews can be performed at different points in the hiring process. Common interview is the phone screening. This is usually the earliest interview and is to get a feel for you as a possible candidate or to explain the position better and get a feel for what you might be in the market for. This can happen well in advance of any actual action towards the possibility of hiring. This can also happen prior to you actually submitting an application if a hiring manager decided to contact you about the position instead of you approaching them. So going back to when we spoke about hiring managers, this is basically a hiring manager reaching out to you pre or post application to screen you for future possible interviews to see if you're good for a role. It tends to be casual, and it's a good opportunity to see if the position is worth pursuing. This is most commonly done by the hiring manager, though it can be done by a director, and it's so that they can touch base and ensure you aren't a crazy person or a fraud. And I've had interviews where I've been the first contact as a lead or a director on a project. I've had a director reach out to me. More commonly, especially these days, you're going to get a hiring manager do this screening and kind of offload that work from a director or a lead. Sometimes you'll have both, but they're kind of going to be acting as your contact anyways, a bit of a liaison, if you will. So oftentimes it's going to be with your hiring manager. And as mentioned in the hiring manager section, that also means sometimes they won't really go too deep into everything. It's going to be more, where are you at? What are you looking for? Kind of almost a secretarial approach to get down the basics so that they can deliver that package to a lead or director or a team and be like, this is what they're looking for. This is where they're at. Would you be able to, if we were to move forward, start soon, start later, all that kind of basic information you might expect. That's usually what is going to happen in a screening. Oftentimes, this is when salary bands will be spoken of as well. If you do not have a number in mind, you can ask what the salary band is for the position for your consideration. And a salary band is just the range of available salary that they could assign to the position. So if you were a senior, they might go, the salary band is 120,000 to 140,000. And that means that your possible salary could land somewhere in there. Oftentimes, they're just going to ask you, if you're interested in the role, especially if you applied, what salary are you looking for? You do not always have to have an immediate answer, but you will probably want to go in with a general idea of what you're looking for in case you enter negotiations. Negotiations won't usually happen here, though. They're more trying to get a basic idea of what you're looking for. Phone screenings, despite the name, can be a phone call, but oftentimes are video calls. So that's another thing. If you are going to be applying these days, it's generally good to have a video camera available. You don't need to, but oftentimes they're going to want to meet face-to-face online and just kind of get a feel for you as a person. This also helps them get a better idea that you are a real person and not playing at something or trying to be deceptive. Onward we go. Sometimes if the phone screening is with a hiring manager and art director interview can follow. That says and. It's supposed to say N. This doesn't always happen. It can be a handoff from the hiring manager to the art director in the phone screening, or be its own interview if the hiring manager felt good about the experience. It's similar to the hiring manager interview, except with the art director or an art discipline lead, which is just someone who's in charge of like 2D or 3D or VFX or whatever. So that you can get into questions that deal more closely with your skill set and the job's pipeline. To continue, the main interview process is next. This is what most people think of when they talk about getting an interview. For most companies, a team interview means that they're already interested in your skill set and your portfolio. Now they want to cover any uncertainties in your skill set and gauge your personality to see how you might fit in with the team. They also want to see if you were maybe lying on your resume or your portfolio. So this is the media interview. This is usually where wars are won or lost, right? Most companies really are already interested in you if they get you to the interview process. It's not always the case, but generally people don't want to waste their time, especially their team's time. So that's something to consider. But don't think that that means you're going to get anything. They're just looking into you. There could be 20 other applicants that they're interviewing as well. You never know. Getting an interview does not indicate you're the only candidate in the running, but usually does mean you're in consideration. Hey, wow, that's a nice, short, concise version of what I just said. The goals and forms of these interviews can vary between companies, but most commonly, you'll have one or more rounds of interviews with different folks, either at once or in turns, from your intended discipline and other related disciplines. Depending on the company and size of team, these interviews can be remote, they can be in person, and sometimes, due to employee availability, extended interviews might take place over multiple days. I had one of these with one of the companies that I was interviewing with. We actually had 2 different days of interviews. A first group on like a Tuesday, I think it was, and then the second group was on the Thursday of that week. Sometimes this can be like a couple people on one week, and then on the next week, it really just depends. Especially with larger teams, sometimes they just don't have the time to get everybody they need to sit down and interview for a key role. So you're kind of trying to match your schedule to their schedule. That's also sometimes going to mean that you'll end up in an interview for a 2D position and you'll have somebody there who's not necessarily of your discipline. Like you're like, oh, I'm a 2D artist, I'm interviewing, and they're like, oh, here's the FX lead and somebody from the 3D team. That's likely going to happen, but then you might get additional producers or other people who wouldn't normally be there because they're filling in for someone else, and they're going to ask the questions that person wanted to ask you, and they're going to kind of report back to them. Often as well, employees will be on Slack during these or a messaging internal system, and they'll collectively think of questions they want to ask a candidate if they feel there's any areas of uncertainty. If it's a small studio, you might only meet with 1 or 2 people, and a lot of particulars will be skipped. You never know. You really just don't know. Sometimes you get tested or asked questions to see where your knowledge sits. Other times you'll merely be answering things already mentioned on your resume about your experience. That already mentioned on your resume, like, get used to that. We actually had somebody who interviewed for a position with one of my teams, and they got really upset during the 3rd interview, which I was a part of. So they'd interviewed, like I said earlier, over the course of 3 days. And I was in the 3rd set, and we were asking them to elaborate on some things in their resume, and they're like, you guys need to talk to each other more because you're wasting my time. Now, on one hand, they're right. Like, you should kind of communicate between days and be like, hey, we already asked these, we already got these. If you don't feel that it was covered, cover it again. And there wasn't a lot of communication at the time, but on the other hand, it really kind of made a bad impression to be angry at the people interviewing you in the way. Some people might see that as bad. Some people might see it as, oh, this is actually a good sign. They've got the gumption or whatever. We saw it as neutral. I saw it as neutral because I'm like, that's a good point. I just wouldn't have brought it up that way. Don't get frustrated if this happens. There you go. Simply retell the information in your own words as comfortably as you can. Remember, we're not talking about how to improve the process necessarily. We're talking about how to improve your chances within the process. So sometimes something stupid's going to happen. Just go with it if it's not a red flag, The resume is there to list what you've done, and the interview is there so you can elaborate on those skills and experiences through conversation. A lot of resumes going to be shorthand. A lot of people are going to be asking you, did you fluff your resume here? They won't usually just say that. They'll more ask you specific questions to suss out if you did. This goes back to the resume section where I said don't fluff too much. Don't say anything that can't be vetted. You know what I mean? Because if they investigate it during the interview, they're probably going to investigate it elsewhere, including background checks. Also, do not get frustrated if different team members ask you similar questions. You don't know whom has been talking to whom, and you should treat each section of the interview as new and separate. Team members will likely prepare questions in advance, that's what I was talking about earlier, and try to address any oddities or concerns on your resume or portfolio and get a feel for how you would approach the job. Sorry if you hear me drinking. That's what you get. when you get a free presentation from me. They may lead into things like hobbies and casual conversation to get an idea of what working with you would be like. Some of the most common questions you will be asked is to tell them about your background. Why are you interested in the job? What do you consider your strengths? This can vary greatly, though, and it always depends on the team. So this is something you can also investigate on your own, is just kind of look into what kind of questions are game dev interviews usually asking you, and you'll get a lot of things like this, and that way you can prepare for them in advance. Should be obvious, but half of the interview process is simply showing you aren't a shithead or an idiot. This is true. This is really what it comes down to. Some places are going to try and trick you or whatever, but generally in art and interviews, people are trying to get just a feel for you as a person. Are you going to fit in with the vibe of the team? Are you overly aggressive? Can you put your thoughts into words? Can you discuss things with the team? Remember, interviews should not be one-sided. You can ask them questions as well. This is as much an opportunity to see if the team and these folks are a good fit for you as you are for the team. Key point there that I feel a lot of people miss. You're on the defensive generally when you're in an interview. You're worried, I want the position. You're worried, what will they think of me? You're worried, do I stack up to whomever else did this? But you're also probably going to want to be worried about, does this team feel right to me? Does this team feel like I could work with them? Are they conveying their information in a way that's conducive to me getting my work done? Would I want to spend a lot of time working with these people in the foreseeable future? If you're concerned that there might not be time for questions, you can politely request a few minutes for you to ask questions at the end of the interview session. That's also important because sometimes people will be strapped for time. You can kind of make this clear at the beginning, politely, and just be like, hey, I really appreciate this interview. Before we get started, can I ask that there maybe be 5 minutes at the end? I have a few questions I'm probably going to want to ask as well. Generally, people are going to say yes. I've never seen a team say no, but I'm sure there's someone out there. If you aim to do this, it's best to prepare some questions you might have in advance, which is good practice. This doesn't mean you have to have every question prepared. Probably goes without saying, but we're going to say it anyways. If you come up with questions in the duration of the interview, you can ask those at the end. And if you have a pen and paper, you can write down a shorthand for a question you've just thought of so you remember it later. Generally, if you do that, you want to do common courtesy and excuse yourself and be like, sorry, I'm just writing a question I thought. Or if the rapport is good, you can ask that question during that back and forth in that point of the interview. It's never uncommon to ask questions during the heart of the interview as well. It's meant to be a conversation. These questions can be about the current topic, the team, how they work, but also the company itself. Things such as work-life balance, culture, how often crunch arises, etc. Address any concerns you might have. This is really when you want to get the concerns out there, because at this point, you've likely already talked to a hiring manager and you're kind of getting into the meat of the process. This is where you can navigate any red flags or any thoughts you might have, because afterwards, regardless of where it goes, you're kind of going to be in the thick of it. A good question I like to ask is, what would the day-to-day for this position generally look like over the course of a week? This kind of sets them up to approach it from a direction they might not normally be approaching. Like, oh, your duties will be, concept characters. Sometimes we do this, sometimes. But you're asking a lot of things with this one question. You're asking, what is the scheduling like? What's the workload like? What's the expectation of communication? All of that. So you can really get an idea for what that feels like. And then you can formulate further questions from that, or you can just go, wow, that sounds like terrible time. I don't want to be here. They will be looking for red flags, but you should be as well. I assume everybody knows what a red flag is, but just in case, generally we're talking about warning signs of something bad, right? Something that someone says or a method that they mention that's going to put alarms off in your head and go, whoa, that doesn't sound right, or that sounds bad, that kind of thing. Remember, these are people you will likely be spending a lot of time collaborating with, and you want to be sure it's a comfortable fit. Ooh, we've been at this for a while. I have some work to get into the shop. Time for me to tag in my partner. It's rare that he shows up, but he's going to walk you through some general tips for interviews. He's oddly going to sound very similar as well. Happy adventuring. Hail, traveler. Time to get into some general interview advice. I can't draw. So this is what you get. Anyway, let's begin. If you feel it will help, try to do a mock interview with a friend or a colleague. You can look up common questions in interviews for your discipline and practice so you can feel a bit more confident and less on the spot with your answers in an interview. That's another important one. You want to be able to kind of naturally talk about things so you don't get so worried in the interview. If you have somebody who works in the industry or just a buddy or even someone in your family that you can kind of bounce things off of or have them ask you questions and then try and get a feel for it, that would be a huge benefit if you're not used to interviewing. Interviewing is a skill. It's not something everyone can do easily. It puts you on the spot and it really taxes you socially. So practice is good. Remember, if you're on a remote call, you can have your resume up on a second monitor. So if you forget any specifics, it's right there for you to reference. Oftentimes, you're provided the names of folks that you're scheduled to interview with. You can use this opportunity to research them, familiarize yourself with their work and their history, which might clue you into what you might need to know and what they might ask you. It's not creepy to do this, as long as you're not being weird about it. If you get an interview list and they're like, hey, you're going to work with these people, so they're going to be in your interview. You have Jay Axer, that's me. I'm on your interview list for Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You can then look up my LinkedIn, try and find my portfolio, see what I'm about, see where I'm coming from, and that might give you some insight to what you're dealing with and so forth. That's generally a good idea. Don't be late for your interview. If for some reason this is unavoidable, let your hiring manager know as soon as you're able that you will need to reschedule and apologize for the inconvenience. Sometimes people will freeze up for this and just not show up. I've had it happen multiple times. And I will talk to them afterwards, and each time they've just been, oh, well, something came up, but I was so nervous I didn't know what to say, so I just didn't show up. That's the worst thing you could do. You always want to be in communication, because now you're signaling that if we were to hire you, you're not going to tell us important information. So now we're probably not going to hire you unless it was a major emergency, a family member needed to be hospitalized, and we could reasonably assume your mind was elsewhere. Just communicate, right? Just let people know. Be ready 10 minutes early. Don't be fashionably late. Don't show up at the second, be like, oh, hold on, everybody's on a schedule. Common sense. Don't try to be cute and sarcastic. You want to be upfront and genuine. Don't show up in person stinking and unshowered. This happens more often than one might think. I did some in-person interviews, and there was an individual who was incredibly unshowered, and we were in a small room, and all we ended up talking about after the interview was how really unsettlingly gross it was to be around this person. Didn't really matter at that point what their qualifications were. We weren't going to hire them. Don't do online camera interviews looking like absolute shit. At least try to be casually presentable. You don't need to wear a suit. You don't need to wear a tux. You don't need to do any of the crazy thing. But, look like you care at least a little bit, right? Game dev is fairly casual, even in large studio environments. You'll find a lot of people with just messy beards, thrown on t-shirts, and a hoodie or whatever, and unkempt hair, and that's generally fine. But for your interview, at least try a little bit, Don't do your video interview from a bar or the beach or some stupid place like that. Speaks for itself. Even if they begin to use foul language, it's best to avoid doing so yourself. I'll be honest, I've let slip some curses in interviews before on both sides. It didn't actually hurt me when I was interviewing, and when I interview other people, I'm just kind of like, I don't know where they're coming from. I probably shouldn't do that, even if we cuss a lot in studio. You just want to be a little more professional even than you normally would be. Not uncomfortably so, right? But you just want to navigate it from a professional point of view. So even if everybody's sailors, Sometimes the choice is not to. This one, though, you can get away with it a lot. This isn't a hard rule. It's just a consideration. If you're like, I'm not sure what I should do, always err on the side of caution. That's my recommendation to you. Try not to slouch way down in your seat or fidget excessively. People get nervous. People want to be comfortable to offset how uncomfortable they are in other areas, especially in in-person interviews. Just try and be present physically. And in video interviews, try not to let them only look at your eyes and the top of your head. It happens. It's not the end of the world. You probably won't lose the job. But again, a lot of times people are just looking for, will you be respectful? Don't falsify your answers. Silence your phone during an interview and don't look at text messages. If you're showing people that you don't have time to be there, that you don't have the attention span to speak with these people who are interviewing you for a possible position, what are you doing? Be comfortable, but don't be so casual that it feels like you couldn't care less if you got the position or not. I went in for a position I didn't really want. I ended up getting it, and it ended up being a good position, so I'm glad that I got it. But even though I was like, I don't really care, I behaved like I cared more than I did when I was there, because they were taking the time and I was there, and it's just kind of insulting to them to not listen and to not be present. And it was a good idea that I did, because it turned out to be a really, really good position as well. Don't chew gum during an interview or anything like that. This is disrespectful to everyone's time that they took out of their workday to be there with you. This kind of also paints it a little adversarial. I'm not going for that, just so you know. You don't want to be at war with these people. Generally, they should be hoping that you're a good fit, and you're hoping they're a good fit, and you're able to have a good conversation. In my interview experience, and especially for teams that I've led, our goal was always, can we casually talk with this person, even if they're nervous? You know what I mean? Like, that's why sometimes you'll get questions like, well, what's your favorite hobby or whatever? And I've seen people online say things like, well, who cares what my hobby is? That's nothing to do with the job. It's like, yeah, but the goal of that was not to find out what your hobby is necessarily. A lot of the times the goal of that question is simply to have a casual conversation with you to see what that's like. Let's get into what actually talking about something that interests you is going to feel like. People get nervous in interviews. This is okay and totally normal if you do, but try to find a way to manage it if you can. Again, kind of like we spoke on soft skills. It's okay to be like, man, I suck in this area, I'm whatever, but it's not okay to go, so that's just how it is. I'm going to put zero effort into it. I'm just bad at interviews, bop's own head. Don't do that. Do not use this as an opportunity to air grievances with previous positions. This will reflect poorly on you and indicate that you will do this to them as well. Remember, you want to behave like someone that you would want to work with. Oh man, interviews are super fun, because sometimes people will come in there and they're the angriest person in the world, and they will just go off on their previous employers. They'll be like, this specific person that I'm naming did this thing here, and this boss was terrible, and this company was so blah, 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 blah. But you got to remember that the more you complain in an interview, the more it's also going to sound like maybe you were the problem. And also, it's going to just make them feel like that's what you're going to do when you're not around them. If you're doing this and talking smack about all these people, it doesn't really matter if it's true or if you're right. I'm going to assume that when I'm not around and you're pissed about a call I made or something, that's what you're going to be doing to me. It's not a good look. Generally, there's a way to do this. You can discuss bad experiences at previous jobs, and you can reshape them in ways that won't come off like that. An example of that, if you were like, wow, this company screwed me over and the boss was terrible, is you can be like, oh, I had an unfortunate experience there where my manager and I weren't able to see eye to eye, and I felt that it wasn't justified. So I decided that it was time to move on because I couldn't navigate the situation. Now you sound kind of professional. It's very much corpo speak, but it's not directly targeting someone. You're just like, hey, this didn't really work. But then you can contextualize it in a positive way afterwards and be like, I realized I needed this or this, and now that's kind of where I'm at, and I think that we could avoid that in the future. If you're going to speak on bad experiences, try to focus only on the experience and not specific people. Springboard off that to turn it into something that was overcome in a positive fashion. I mean, there you go. Don't be performative. That'd mean you have to do that performance every moment of every workday. Also, it's a shitty thing to do. Why put yourself through the stress? So, like, going into an interview and be like, hey, everybody, haha, I'm Mr. Charisma. And it's not really you. Now everyone's going to expect that. And if you break it, then they know you're weird and full of crap. And if you don't break it, now that's just whatever percentage of your, you know, cognitive energy that you have to spend every day putting on that mask. People do have working masks, like I do as well. I'm not super social, but there's effort you need to put into. But then there's just playing a fake role. Don't be so awkward that people cannot have a normal and reasonable conversation with you. Again, it's not okay to just be like, well, that's how I am. I'm not going to put any effort. You're going to have to be capable of working with other people. You're going to have to be capable of working in teams. So if you're awkward, that's fine. But if you're so awkward that no one can talk to you about anything, that's become a you problem, not a them problem. There should be room for you to be yourself, but you will have to talk around and work with teams. Being so shy you cannot get a word out, or so awkward that nobody can decipher the puzzle that is you, simply won't be good for anyone. If someone doesn't hire you simply because you were reasonably nervous, you probably don't want to work there anyways. So, while you're being afraid, am I too nervous? Be reasonable and get objective opinions on your behavior from other people that you can rely on. And maybe there's a situation where you're like, well, this wouldn't be a good fit anyway. If a team spends the entire interview trying to lay traps and trick you instead of getting to know you and being respectful, just walk away. Most people won't walk away in this situation because they want the job a lot. But really, there's an expectation of respect that goes in both directions. I had a tale told to me and verified that this was true. I won't name the company because we're not doing that in this presentation, but they would get about 15 or so people together in chairs, and they would get an interviewee in. This was for a design position, mind you, like not a visual design, but like a game design. And they would sit the person down in a chair, and they'd create a half moon circle around them, and everyone would sit there 15 on one and just shotgun questions out at them. And when they would start to answer, another person would shotgun a question. They didn't even care what the questions were. Their goal was to frazzle and intimidate, almost like a hazing ritual, the person. And they would make judgments based off this person on how they reacted to that pressure, which had absolutely nothing to do with the job. They were just like, hey, can they take the team, razzing them? And it's like, that's probably not a team you really want to work with. And it was a problem. The claim by one of the individuals involved was like, well, when you design, you're under pressure. That never happened on that team. It was just people feeling like they had some power and wanting to exercise it. In my opinion, that's a red flag. You can read that situation the way that you want to, but I'm saying that that's also uncommon. But I would avoid something like that. I do know an individual who was in that situation. They did walk away. It was the right decision for them. But remember, you can always politely be like, thank you for your time. I don't think this is going to work out. A difficult question is not a trick or a trap, by the way. Very important difference to make here. If you're like, whoa, they're asking me a hard question, that's not them trying to trick you. That's them trying to see if you can navigate that. And depending on the position, I will say this happens a little less in art. Usually in art, they'll be like, well, if you were to take this character from our game and redesign them for this purpose, how would you do it? But in design and programming, you'll get a lot of difficult questions, and a lot of that time is them spending kind of looking and see, how do you approach a problem? Can you find an answer? Do you just kind of sit there and go, I wish I had Google, that kind of thing. You can always say no. If the interview has you feeling uneasy afterwards, you can contact the hiring manager to let them know you appreciate their and the team's time, but you feel that you might not be a good fit for their team at the moment. If you do want to bow out, I do recommend contacting the hiring manager. Don't ghost them, because sometimes that will have lasting consequences and they will remember that. So always just be polite about it and be like, hey, unfortunately, you don't even need to list the reasons. You can just be like, I just don't feel it's a good fit. They may ask you the reason, then that's in your court, whether you want to answer that or not. But I'm usually vague if that happens. You can, and honestly should, Write a thank you correspondence to your hiring manager to thank them and the team for their time in the interview. That's regardless of how it turns out. If it was a good interview, thank them. If it was a bad interview, thank them. If it was anything, thank them. If you were there at all, thank them. If they scheduled you for an interview and they didn't show up, contact the hiring manager and ask them what happened. And when they explain what happened, thank them. Lastly, at some point, you will be asked when you're available to start. The instinct might be to say right away, and in some circumstances, this will be the right answer. If you're able to, and have enough cash to maintain it, consider giving yourself some time to collect yourself. If you're changing jobs, you could give yourself a short vacation before diving back into the workforce. Not everybody has this opportunity. Sometimes you're strapped for cash. Sometimes it's your first job. You're not switching jobs. You need it now. But you can always at least discuss, do I need to start next week? You know, even if they say as soon as possible, maybe your possible isn't that soon. Can I start in 2 weeks? Can I start in 3 weeks? That is a conversation you can have and negotiate, especially if they're interested. That's it. You should be better equipped to have yourself a legendary interview. Farewell, traveler. Hey, it's Q&A time. All right. So that was a bit of information. Are there any questions that anybody has about interviews? All right, questions. If you're fairly certain that an interview has gone poorly and will not result in moving on to the next step in the process, is it worth withdrawing before they turn you down, or does it matter at all? That's probably the most expected answer. It's gonna be up to you. I usually, if I'm interested, I would wait and see what they say because you never know. But if it's gone poorly and you feel it's gone poorly as well, and you're not interested, then obviously withdraw as soon as possible because you're wasting your time, you're wasting their time. But if you want it, I would still wait because something that can also happen depending on the team. This is rare, but it can happen is that you could end up getting feedback for why they felt it went poorly if you don't know something, or you could possibly ask me like, I'm sorry, would I be able to get some information perhaps on why they felt I wasn't a good fit, or maybe something I did wrong. Next question. You mentioned some interviews trying to trip you up. Do you have examples or common ones? Well, I showed the like half moon harassment example, or rather talked about it. For me personally, I was only really tackled once in an interview where they were trying to decipher whether or not I did the work in my portfolio, which isn't really a trap, you know, it's just like, can you? And they kind of wanted me to on the spot do a bunch of stuff, but they kept switching what that stuff was while I was trying to perform the drawing. And it got to the point where it felt like it went from we want to test you or see if you can do this to now they know that I can do it, but they're just kind of fucking with me. You know what I mean? Like, oh, we'll add this. Oh, we'll do this. Oh, like I'm a little dancing animal for them or something. And I didn't appreciate that. That wasn't too bad, but I also didn't take that position. Not necessarily because of that either, but a lot of times in art, if they're trying to lay a trap for you, it won't even be art related. It will be in conversation because art's a very visual medium, even in technical related art and VFX and things like that. You're going to usually be in the interview and people will try to trip you up by getting you to say something or making you flustered by asking you too many things too quick or trying to ask you something completely unrelated. And it's kind of in your court, unfortunately, and that sucks the less experience you have to decipher, is this related to what's going on? Is this relevant in a way that this is useful, or are they wasting my time and trying to be funny? I will tell you, in my experience and those who I've worked with, most interviews are in good faith. Really, it's just people who want to find a good fit for the position. But in interviews, just like when they're looking at your portfolio or your resume, people will be judging you much more harshly than they would judge themselves or people that they work with or anything like that. So you will be scrutinized in ways you might not expect, and sometimes that comes out during the interview. Have you ever received a surprising question in an interview from an applicant that made you go, that's a good question? It's hard to remember. It's been almost 16 years of game dev I've worked, and I've worked hiring at multiple jobs, directly on two. And um, I would say I'm usually surprised by questions that are confidently asked that aren't just like the expected surface level ones. But I can't quite remember one where it was a specific surprising one, so you'll have to bear with me. I do know that somebody did drop the like, what's the day to day look like for a work week on me before, and I don't actually hear that very often. And that is a good question, which is why I put it on the example list, because it kind of allows me to get into a way of dispensing that information in an organized fashion. The other side that I probably should have gotten into in this section is that a lot of people who will interview you are sometimes really bad at giving interviews. They're just people who are hired into the job. When I worked on Hearthstone, we had this. Sometimes we would give interviews, and they're like, "Well, we want people from each discipline," and sometimes we'd have someone from a discipline that just was an awful interviewer. They would sit there and not know what to say. They wouldn't know how to respond, and it made the person applying uncomfortable. So, that's something to consider as well. But going back to that's a good question. Honestly, I prefer people who have questions that aren't wasting our time, that seems to be something they genuinely want to know and is going to dig into anything we didn't go over. So when someone's prepared and then they also are adding new questions on top of those, that usually feels pretty good because they're showing they're interested, they're showing they're paying attention, they're showing they know what they're talking about, and they're digging for pertinent information. And that kind of leads into a conversation between you and the person you're interviewing that makes it more natural, and that's always good for everybody. Not quite an answer to to the question, but that's about as close as we get. Are any questions considered taboo? Like, how often does the studio end up crunching? That's a good question. There you go. um, it it depends on the studio. Unfortunately, some places really don't like certain questions, and sometimes it really is because they know that they're not going to have a pleasant answer for it. Uh, Generally, now, if you ask a place how often do you crunch, the expectation is they'll just answer you. I've seen I've seen an interview go bad that I was giving where we were asked, how often do you crunch? And before I could answer, one of my associates decided to kind of have a little mini freak out about it and go like, well, that's not something you should really be concerned about. And I'm like, whoa, 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 actually they should. So it also just depends on who you're interviewing with. When I interviewed with my current job that I have right now, which is an excellent position, I asked that question. I said, how often do we crunch? And how often would I be able to take a Friday off? And I found out after the fact, when they said my interview went great, that the hiring manager who was in the initial interview asked the director, is this a red flag? He's asking about taking a Friday off or crunch. Does this mean he's lazy? And luckily, the director's like, no, that's questions you should ask. But, somebody else could have been in that position and been like, yeah, the first thing they're asking in an interview is when they can take time off. That's not good, but it's a reasonable question. So if I wouldn't say taboo in those directions, but asking about crunch, asking about time off, asking about stuff like that aren't as far as like, do I get unlimited PTO? What's the limited PTO look like? And you're just actually asking more generalized. Those can be kind of like noise questions where you're not really sure how it's going to land. So you're going to want to make sure you frame it a certain way just in case. Taboo questions are honestly like bad questions. Like if you start asking really racist shit or something like that, where you're just a bad person. So generally, you can ask most things like, what about crunching? What about time off? Are there protections for workers here? How do you feel about unions? That union one, depending on where you go, especially big studios, they most likely will be told they're not allowed to talk about it, and how they frame it to you would be pretty interesting. But again, they might be told, in secret, don't hire people who want to go into unions. So it is difficult to manage those. I don't have a direct answer for that because it's complicated, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight. Speaking of masking in an interview, what's the general tone in November 2024 for wearing COVID safe mask in an interview? So, more and more now interviews are done not in person. So that's easy. But in person, in my circles and people I speak to, which I would say are reasonable people, they've had people show up wearing masks. The last I heard about was last month, so October. Um, uh, they had no problem with it. The company generally doesn't have a problem with it. A lot of these companies are going to be leaning towards like reasonable personal rights and whatnot. So there doesn't tend to be any static given for somebody wearing masks. But that's a tough one to answer because mileage may vary. A lot of the upper management, I would say, tends to lean in a political direction that maybe doesn't think about that kind of stuff. But at the worker level, usually people are just like, if that's what you do, that's what you do. I will say that right now, masking in studios is almost nobody ever does it. And my partner goes in, and they're generally the only one with a mask like that they encounter at all. So at the same time, nobody says anything. Nobody harasses them. Nobody gives them any static. They just assume, well, there's a reason for it. How do you distinguish a difficult question from a trap question? So what you want to do is listen to the question and think, is this relevant? Is any way that I could answer this actually helpful to giving insight to the position? Or are they just kind of harassing you? You know what I mean? That's really what it is. You've got to kind of think, what is the outcome of this question? Are they kind of just trying to fuck with me? Or is this a difficult question where it's like, well, how would you go about designing from a technical standpoint, these concepts to support the 3D artist and the implementation? And, we use this engine, so we can't do this and we can do this. So navigate that for me, lay out for me, your approach and things you would and wouldn't do. That's just a nice question. That's a considerate question of, well, do you consider more than a pink coat on a character looks good? Can you actually go, oh, well, yeah, I understand how to approach these limitations, and I've actually worked with that before, or I haven't. I don't have experience with that, but here's what I think would work, and then their reaction is more just paying attention or playing off of that versus like just making fun of you. I did do an interview once where I got made fun of twice for a lack of knowledge in an area, and I thought that was pretty fucked up because it really wasn't relevant to the position I was applying for. But it's almost like when people are like, you haven't seen the movie Titanic? Oh my god, that's so stupid. Where the fuck have you been? Like, what are you doing, dude? You'll probably know. But the reason I mention trap questions or any kind of harassment in interviews and stuff like that is because oftentimes when people are in interviews, they feel they have to answer everything. They feel they're on the ropes, and they're like, if I don't do exactly what these people want me to do, I won't get the job. And sometimes that's true. I'm telling you, there's room to navigate there. How would you best approach a hardship-related gap of pertinent roles in a resume during an interview? Yeah, so I'm honestly just as honest about it as I could be, and that's usually what I recommend. So if you're like, hey, yeah, I haven't been working here, or I didn't work for a year, didn't work for 2 years, and you can see that on the resume, you can tell as much or as little as you want. Oftentimes, people won't ask you too much about it. I've had people in an interview with like a 3-year gap before, and generally I'll be like, anything I should know about here? You know what I mean? I kind of leave it up to their interpretation, and, they can answer. Some places might scrutinize that, but generally what you're going to encounter, and again, the theme of this talk, you're going to notice is there is no absolute answer because you're going to encounter a lot of different situations, but I'm trying to equip you for ones you're more likely to see, is if you offer excess information, a lot of times that's on you. If it was personal health or something happened, a lot of times what the interviewer is going to be looking for is, were you lacking work because you were a shithead at your previous job, everybody knew it, and no one wanted to hire you? so you have a 3-year gap? Or was it completely unrelated? You were in a circumstance where you weren't able to work, which is a key thing. You could just straight up say, I was in a position where I was unable to perform work and I had to take, a reprieve from doing so, but now I'm back, and you can kind of approach it that way. Most people are going to be understanding. If you're in the interview, it's very likely that you had the experience on your resume or your portfolio was shining enough that they're interested. So they're just trying to get to know you. And if you can navigate that discussion well, a lot of times that's actually a positive, as was the case that I mentioned. I haven't encountered it too much, but generally, if you're just like, yeah, well, here was a circumstance, it's not related to this or whatever, and, I had to step away or I was doing this, you can be vague as long as you're professional about it. And most of the time, people are just going to be like, okay, yeah, they just weren't working then. That's fine. All right. Let's see. Scrolling down. Here we go. Next question. With regards to many industry applications I see, for those without a formal degree, what should you say if the question of your education comes up when you're self-taught or informally trained? Just say you're self-taught. Like, if they need a degree for the position, and that's where the conversation is going, and I kind of touched on this a bit before in the resume section. If it's coming up because it's required for performance and they're like, well, we don't hire anyone without a degree, I'm not really sure why you're in the interview at that point if they can see on your resume that you don't have a degree. If they ask about your education and you're self-taught, you can just get into that. My recommendation at that point is to control the conversation as much as you can. Not in like a weird, like, hey, shut up about that way. I mean, like in a way where you're like, I'm self-taught, but I've studied these areas, I feel very confident about this, and my experience has been, and you can get into the experience that you've had, and now you're controlling that conversation away from I lack formal training in a college environment to I have trained in this other environment and taught myself, which is actually a huge skill because a lot of people can't do that. I never went to college myself, and that's how I've navigated those conversations, and there hasn't been a time it's turned out negative. Doesn't mean it won't, but I'm saying most likely, again, if you control that conversation and you can express to them, this is areas that I have expertise in, these are things that I've practiced, I've worked in this area a lot, you can then explain that you have experience or even on-job experience on your resume that replaces that formal education. Next question. I've been told that not asking questions when given the chance to, or not asking enough questions or the right questions can be viewed as negative during interviews. Do you have suggestions on safe questions to ask, even if you genuinely didn't have any, having done the research or a similar job previously, for example? That is a good question. So yeah, that is true. Sometimes when people are not asking questions, certain personality types will take that as you are disinterested or whatever. I've been in a situation where I actually couldn't think of one, and they were like, you have any questions? I'm like, I think we were pretty thorough here. I'm trying to think, and even if you take that approach, then at least they're going to take it as, oh, we did go over a lot and you are putting effort into thinking, and you can be like, I'm not sure, but I will definitely let you know if I have any questions. If I happen to think of further things we didn't go over, but I'm feeling pretty comfortable with this. That's a good approach if you can't think of anything at all. As far as safe questions, just having kind of a back pocket list of questions in advance kind of helps with that. Where if it's art related, for example, and they went over, well, this is what the job looks like, this is how you design, this is blah blah blah, this is what the pipeline looks like. You could then say something like, well, what level of experience should I expect people in the other disciplines to have? Like, is everybody, have they been in the industry a long time? And that way you're asking about the team, even though they may not have gotten into that, and you're just casual banter really that shows any level of interest can take a spot there. It doesn't have to be anything too deep. It just has to be something you didn't go over, or if they went over everything and you still feel like you want to ask questions, try and think of a weird surface level clarification for something somebody has already said. If they're like, well, you're generally going to have what I would call an 8-hour workload. during the day, you know, you're going to do a lot of concepting or whatever, you could still have them elaborate on that. You're like, well, going back to when you said thing, which is always nice because it shows you were paying attention. Could you elaborate on, you know, aspect, that kind of thing? Because you're not really fooling anybody. You're showing you're paying attention, and you might still get information you didn't have that you want. So just kind of playing off what's already there can be safe. That way you don't have to think too hard, because especially when you're on the spot, thinking of new questions can be a real pain in the ass. I definitely sympathize with that. I think we're out of questions. No, we got one more. Is there any professional etiquette on asking questions post interview, like a day or so after? There is. Generally, when you exit a interview, they will say, you know, do you have any further questions or whatever? And when you're done complete with the interview, you'll usually be directed to whoever your contact is. They'll say, like, maybe your lead or director is going to get in contact with you, but you'll already be in contact with the hiring manager. You can ask at the end of the interview to make sure and be like, if I have any further questions, would it be okay if I reached out to the hiring manager? Generally, people are going to be like, of course. I can't imagine somebody saying no, but that would be pretty funny. And then that's going to be the person you contact. Whoever you're in contact with, be it a lead or a director or your hiring manager, the day after or whenever, you would simply be like, hey, sorry to reach out. I actually thought of a few more things I wouldn't mind clarification on, or I had a few more questions or whatever, and you just do that. Just be professional about it. It's honestly expected. I've had people reach out after the fact. It's never a problem. But if you're ever unsure of who your contact would be, just on the exit of the interview, just real quick. Oh, just a quick aside. Who would I contact if I had any further questions? Like, great interview. I really appreciate your time. But who would I talk to? That kind of thing. Oh my gosh, we did it, everybody. We're past chapter 9. All right, let's see what's next.